When cost of living issues dominated the 2007 election, incomes were, in fact, soaring, thanks to the mining boom. Households were feeling the sting of higher interest rates and rising prices. Today, the pressure on households comes not so much from rising prices, although there are still pockets of pain, but from weak wages growth. Loading playing in 5. By definition, households are only better off in real terms when their incomes rise faster than general prices. But real wages have barely budged for most of the decade, and households are beginning to notice. Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe laid out this subdued economic backdrop to the coming federal election in a speech last week to the Australian industry group. He immediately zoned in on the number one thing ailing the Australian economy, namely, the unusually slow growth in wages. On the surface, things don't look so bad. The economy grew by a solid 3.1% over the past year, stronger than expected. Business investment outside the mining sector surged 10%, with particularly strong growth in transport and renewable energy. But households are feeling the pinch. Spending by households, which makes up about two-thirds of the economy, grew just 2.9%. Loading that's despite reasonably solid growth in the number of jobs. More people are keeping their jobs, or getting new ones, but we are paying a price for that. Wage gains remain meager, growing at closer to 2%, rather than the old rates of 3 or 4%. Meanwhile, household debt remains very high, with Sydney and Melbourne property markets going though what the governor delicately termed period of adjustment. This is leaving many households with a mortgage in those cities high and dry. According to Lowe, many people who borrowed expected their incomes to grow at something like the old rate rather than the current rate. With their expectations not being realized, the real value of the debt stays higher than they expected, and this is likely to affect their spending decisions. Lowe says slow growth in wages, combined with this debt hangover, is diminishing our sense of shared prosperity. Warning, Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe. Photo, Trevor Collins. This is dangerous new territory for the Australian political and economic landscape. If this remains the case, it can make needed economic reforms more difficult, warns Lowe. Put simply, the less prosperous we begin to feel, the harder it becomes to secure the very sorts of difficult economic reforms that will, in fact, secure our future prosperity. It's like a downward spiral. Tax reform, that is, shifting the burden of taxation onto activities which are less easy to distort, like consumption, is best done when times are good and the kitty is full to compensate losers. But that time has passed. Society doesn't have the appetite. Lowe opined last week on the prospects for tax reform. He described the government's $140 billion personal income tax cut plan as one step in that process. But it's just one step. That's not to say tax reform will be absent from the coming election, which is shaping up as a bonanza for tax accountants, whom bewildered voters will no doubt need to consult before entering the ballot box to figure out if they'll be better or worse off under each party. Voters will need to consider the impact on their hip pockets of Labor's more ambitious, if limited, tax reform agenda, including changes to property investment taxes, family trusts and dividend imputation credits. Some of Labor's tax changes are worthy, and the coalition remains wedded to company tax cuts. But overall, neither party is countenancing the bigger picture tax reforms, like increasing the GST, which would deliver a noticeable growth dividend by sustainably funding other tax cuts. In reality, the great era of economic reform has been over for some time. The low-hanging fruits of reform, like floating the dollar, slashing tariff barriers, deregulating the labor market and privatizing the finance sector, are long since completed projects. Prospects for meaningful tax reform have dimmed ever since Labor bungled its response to the Ken Henry Review and its proposed mining tax. One member of that review remarked at the time that the mishandling set back the cause of tax reform in this country by a decade. Double that, I'd say. But ultimately, as Lowe notes, the ability to generate real wages growth again in this country will depend on our ability to lift the productivity of our people. And in this respect, it's not just governments asleep at the wheel. Boosting productivity also requires bosses with the vision to go beyond cost-cutting and invest in acquiring new technologies and equipping their workers with the skills to use them. Overall, Lo says Australian businesses have been too focused on cost-cutting and not enough on deploying new technologies. This cost control mentality does not make for an environment where firms are willing to pay larger wage increases. In the absence of a far-sighted business sector or any political appetite for meaningful economic reform, we're left waiting for the forces of supply and demand to restore wages growth. Informal feedback to the Reserve is that labor shortages are happening in some industries. But it's early days. With interest rates already jammed at record lows, it appears Australia has entered a new era of economic torpor, where we wait, as if for Godot, for a new era of economic prosperity to dawn. We could be waiting for some time. In the meantime, we are left squabbling over the scraps.